Hello, I'm MG and I'm back with the number 9 video of Azure MLOps video series. This is fantastic, you already made it, and I'm sure that you have learned a lot through all this video series. Now for this video, we are ready to release our model and deploy it in production, which is going to be an Azure Kubernetes as a compute engine to execute my code, my model that I have, and started to do the prediction and give service or predictive analytics for the end user in production. Let's see how we can do that. Hello again everyone and welcome back to MLOps video series. So in the previous video we created our CI pipeline and then we were able to actually create our release pipeline that is moving that initial solution to staging environment. We deployed the model in a container instance and we tested, we were happy, and now that's the time we can move that model to production as a new release or continuous deployment. But before doing so, let me show you that when we are deploying the model to Azure Container Instance in Azure Machine Learning, it will automatically create Azure Container Instance for you. So let me go to my, this is my Azure Machine Learning, and remember we created our first endpoint using that code we had in DevOps. And if I go to my portal, if I have it open, yes, that's here. Let me drag it down. And this gonna be the resource group we created using infrastructure as a code, and you can see that this is something new that we didn't have it before because we deployed our first model in a container instance, so it created for us. And if I go to containers, this is, you can see the container that is already running and the image was pulled, and we created this container from the image in the container registry, which was actually here. Let me open it, it's a little bit slow. Okay, so we had that container registry, we had the images there, so the image was being pulled to deploy a container inside container instance. Awesome, and we saw the results, we tested the model, we saw everything. Now this is the time we can continue our release pipeline to make the next stage, which would be deploying the model, the solution to production. So I'm gonna click on add, and it's gonna be the next stage. I'm gonna create an empty job. I'm gonna assign everything by myself. Okay, let's name it as deploy, now this time to prod or production. And then I think I'm good for now. Let's create some tasks. So the first thing, again, I want to do Ubuntu machine as my agent, and I want to start to create my first task. Again, as you can guess, I need Python, so use Python version. I'm gonna add, we have done that before a couple of times, so it should be fairly quick, and this is the version I would like to have. And the next task would be creating the same thing, my Azure machine learning extension, right? So I Azure CLI, we need to install that ML extension. I click on here, we're gonna name it as Azure CLI, the ML extension. And we already have the connection created for me, and the script gonna be in line. We had it before, and let me just copy and paste it here quickly. Okay, fairly simple, that's it. And then the next task, what gonna be? Well, we need to deploy the model in production. So can we use container instance again to deploy the model as we did before? Well, in production, you can, but as best practice, you can use Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is a kind of orchestrator for all your containers. Let's say you have a cluster inside Kubernetes that you have multiple nodes or pods, and when, for example, one of those endpoints gonna fail, you have a backup to replace. So as a best practice for production, we're gonna make sure there is no interruption when we are performing and giving services to our end user to do the predictions, right? So Kubernetes is actually retrieving all those best practices and service us in a way to make sure we have no interruption and less latency when we are deploying the model in production. That's why, to save the cost, we just deploy the model in container for staging, but gonna be the same thing here in production, but instead of container, we're gonna have Kubernetes. So for doing so, first we need to create an Azure Kubernetes services. Well, how we can create it? Of course, we can manually create here in my Azure portal and just type Kubernetes and create. But again, DevOps is not a human. So we need to code, and using Azure CLI, we can code and change anything we want in the subscription, create new services, and that's what we're gonna do also here. So again, I wanna use Azure CLI. I click on add. I gotta come here and change it to create Azure Container Instance, or AKS. Let's make a space, it's better. And then I will choose my service connection. Again, the same thing. And let me check if I have the code. Yeah, I have the code, so I can just paste it here. So that's a shell, and it's gonna be an inline script. And the code will be, let me just copy that. Okay, let's see what does this code doing. So I'm using the ML extension, create and compute, and this time I am creating an AKS or Kubernetes, and based on this resource group, workspace, cluster name, VM size. You can see that I have some more variables that I have to define them when I want to create that Kubernetes. So let's add them inside variable now. So let me click on variable. And then the first thing that we need to have is my cluster name that I have for my Kubernetes. So let me add it here. And the value would be Azure Containers, AKS, or whatever you want. Then the next thing gonna be the type of that VM that's gonna run as a container inside my Kubernetes. So again, each of them, they have different names, and as you remember, I showed you already when we were creating compute. The same thing, this one has certain number of cores, a RAM, and you can change them based on the requirement that you want to have. And the number of the agent count in my Kubernetes. So I want to, let's say, make it as 3 for now. And we need to also have a service name for our production, right? So when we are deploying that model in production as a service, we need to have a name for that. So we will see that endpoint as a service inside my production when I gonna open Azure Machine Learning Studio. And now this time, remember for the staging, we had insurance service ACI. Now we use the same name, but we change ACI to AKS because that's in production and we have a different deployment compute. So we added all the variables. Let me get back to the tasks. And now we know that we have these variables. Let me check if they're saved. Yes, they're all saved. Let me just save for now to make sure we don't lose the variables. And now that's the time that we can deploy to our model to the AKS that we are creating here. So I need again another CLI task. I'm gonna click on add, and let's rename it to deploy to AKS. And the connection, the same thing you have seen a couple of times. And for the script type, that's gonna be the same thing as shell, and I wanna have the code already here. I wanna choose inline. So let me copy the code again and paste it here. And let's see what we're doing. So we have already used that deploy in Azure ML extension. We are doing the same thing, but this time we are defining that AKS as a place that I'm going to deploy my model. And the same thing, we are getting the metadata of the model, those kind of configurations that we have. So let's check it out. I think I already showed you, but let me quickly show you what is that deployment configuration for AKS and the inferencing config. So let me open the repo. We are in deployment, and you can see I have Azure Container Instance deployment configuration we did for staging, and now for production I have something similar, but now this time for my Kubernetes. And you can see I have the minimum number of replicas, the max, the amount of CPU, the memory, so on and so forth. So we can define them all here, and when we are deploying our model, we can use that actually to configure my AKS. And also the inference config YAML gonna show me, for example, where is that score.py. This is already here that I'm gonna do the prediction, and these are the configurations that I have for my scoring, which is already defined here as well. You can see I have certain packages, a pip install. I'm using the Python version, and I'm telling that this is my inferencing environment. All right, let's get back to our pipeline. So we know what this code is doing and how we're deploying the model and how we're retrieving the results. But again, before going to the next task, we have to define the working directory for grabbing these YAML files. And as you know, if I go to Advanced, Working Directory, click on three dots, we're gonna choose that landing folder we created, and we're gonna choose deployment. This is the place I have all those YAML files. So deployment, click on OK, and we are now good to go with the next task. So now we have deployed a model in an AKS. So what's gonna be the next task? As you can guess, this is the time I'm gonna test my model that is running in production, right? So the same thing we did before for testing, we need some Python packages to be installed in my agent. So I'm gonna do bash, and I will click on add, I'll come and rename it to call it as, again, the same thing, install Python requirement. And as you remember, we already have that file that we can run actually that code as a bash. So it's in landing package requirement. This is actually my file. And before going to the next task, again, I need to change my working directory. So it's gonna be in my landing and package requirement. Perfect. So this gonna install the requirements that we need, the Python packages, and now that's the time that we can actually test that model in production. So I need to have Azure CLI. So we're gonna rename it as, let's say, production test or prod test. And we're gonna choose that connection that we had before, shell, and the script gonna be inline. So let me copy and paste the code here. That's a little bit longer than what we have seen before, but don't worry, this is not that scary. I can explain. So we have a file for testing our production, a model that we have in prod. Remember, we had something similar for staging. This is already inside my repo. So let me show you. If we go to tests, integration, so we had the staging test, we had a sample data set, doing the prediction and making sure, for example, the prediction outcome is not none. And if it's gonna follow that as such, if each of them are true, it's gonna tell me that, well, your unit tests were all good and your model is working staging. You can define actually this test based on your requirement. That's just a very simple example. So I have the same thing similar for production. I have my sample data set again. I am retrieving that prediction from the given score URI, and then if this is none, it's gonna retrieve an error that telling that one of the unit tests passed because there's something wrong with the model you deployed in production. So I'm using this py, and for executing that .py, I'm using pytest, which is a Python package for running unit test. And again, the same thing, you have seen this part before. I'm just going to publish those test results as a dashboard. So I need to just add this step here. And remember, we had a way that to retrieve the score URL from the model that we deployed in staging, which was inside the container. We're gonna do the same thing to retrieve the URI of the model that we have deployed inside AKS. We need to test it, right? So how we can do it in a code to make this automated based on any model that we're going to deploy in production. So for doing so, before I'm gonna show you how we are retrieving the URI, the same thing we did for container, let me, before I forget, choose the working directory for running this actually code, which gonna be my landing, now testing this time, and integration, because I have my prod test here. So perfect, I have my working directory here, and let's see how we are getting the URI. So Azure ML service show, based on that resource group, we have all these variables already added there, and let's give it a try. So I have already copied that function, the code, and we're gonna paste it in the Cloud Shell, but I have replaced this variable with the real value. So let's get back to my Cloud Shell. Let me see, where is that? Okay, it's already here. Let me copy. Azure ML service show. Let me just copy that and paste it here. All right. Yes, let's run it to see what it's gonna show to us. Oh, it's actually showing us there's no service with this name, which makes sense because we haven't executed the pipeline first. We haven't created any Kubernetes. We haven't deployed the model to Kubernetes. So let me run the pipeline first, and then we're gonna check how this is gonna work. So I think I'm done. We defined the working directory, and let's create the next task. So what we're gonna do, we're just gonna publish the test result of our unit test for production. So I will search, publish, the same thing that we use for staging. Test result, that's here. I'm gonna click on add, and I'm gonna rename it to publishing prod test results this time. And again, I just change it to make it small because that's what I used in the previous steps, to put the results there in a small letters of test. And that's it. So I'm gonna save my pipeline, click on OK, and actually let's start to execute that and see how the model gonna be deployed in a AKS that we're going to create. We're gonna test that model in production and see the test value and results to see the model is performing as we expect in our production area. So let's create a release, deploying to production. So you can see first we deploy to staging and then production, but wait a second. Before we create that release, we have missed something. Are we going to just automatically pass whatever has been successful from staging to production? Well, no, at some points maybe we need manually someone as a person who is responsible to approve and see the results. Let's say, oh, I see that the staging results, the tests were good, so I will approve this model to go to production. So before creating the release, let me get back to the pipeline. And you can see here from staging to production, there's this icon pre-deployment condition. I'm gonna add, and here I can say I need the person to actually approve it. So pre-deployment approvals, select the user from your organization or the project. And I want to disable it, and let's say, enable it, and I'm gonna choose myself because I'm the only person for this workshop now. And I will choose Muhammad. Okay, this is here MG, and that's it. So I think I'm now good. As you can see, this tick sign is already added. I'm gonna save, and now I'm gonna create that release and see what's gonna happen. All right, let me go to release. Again, it's gonna take a while because we're going to first start from the beginning. We grab a new artifact, a new model was trained based on a new code that my data scientist did the push to my repo. We grabbed it, it automatically triggered my staging. Now it's queued to deploy my model staging. It's gonna do the unit test, make sure the model is happy and everything is fine there. And then if it's all good, it's gonna ask me that, hey, that staging, check out the results, sounds everything good. If you're okay, please give your permission. The model will be automated, deployed to production in our Kubernetes. So you can see that how we are step by step following all the best practices of DevOps for machine learning, and how we are moving from staging to production, and how we are automating this process as a life cycle that can be repeated. So now we have a traceable, repeatable kind of machine learning workflow that we were not probably will be easily able to get that when we're using our own laptop in our own silos. But because we have a collaborative environment called Azure Machine Learning plus Azure DevOps, we were able to follow best practices and make this pretty simple and initial example of MLOps. So I'm gonna pause recording here. It's gonna take a while, and I'll resume recording to show you the final outcome. All right, so now I have something cool to show you. So as you can see, I'm resuming the recording. I waited a bit, and now the deployment for staging is successful, and we passed the unit test, and we saw previously the logs, how it is doing actually. So test results and everything is all fine. So let me get back to the release, and as you can see, but deploying to the prod hasn't started yet because it is pending for an approval. So MG, as a person who's responsible to do so, I came there, I checked the logs and everything, that the tests are working properly, and it sounds that the model is ready to go to production to that Kubernetes that I have. So how did I get notification? Let me show you. So I got an email actually from my organization, and that, hey, there's something that needs your approval. So let me show you that email properly. You can see that's telling me deployment from this stage, deploy stage to production is waiting for my approval. And if I click on seeing the approval, you will see that it's gonna actually guide me to the same page that we were. So this is just waiting for my approval. I click on approve. I have, let's say, no comments for now, and then just click on approve again. And now you can see this is approved, and now it's queued to actually start to deploy my model to production. So again, I'm gonna pause the recording and we're gonna come back to see how deployment to production gonna work. All right, finally look at this. So we have deployed our model to production to that AKS and successfully. Let's see what happened here. I'm gonna show you the logs, and you can see that we were able to approve. I got an email, I approved it, and we created the Azure container and we deployed that there. We did some testing. The testing were all running successfully. Let's check it out. This is the URI. Let me open it first, and then you can see that all those unit tests that we had for the model, which is running in production, has been going well. And let's see then what is happening to my Azure machine learning. So let me open that, and remember in the endpoint we just had one model being deployed in my container instance, which was our staging. Let me refresh. There should be a new one coming for the AKS. Awesome, we just created that using our DevOps. We didn't come here, and as you can see, this is created by Surface Principal, not MG, and it is running on AKS. Let's quickly test it. So I'm gonna click on that, and there's the REST endpoint here. Again, the consumer part gonna give me the code, so I'm just gonna copy that, Control A, Control C. Let's create another notebook for testing. I just want to show you how it works. Create a new file. Now we're gonna call it prod testing, and let's click on create. Perfect. Let's paste the code, and I will just remove this part as a data. I have already a sample, so let me just quickly copy that sample data and paste it here. Okay, let me check to make sure this is pasted properly. Yes, that sounds good. And let's run to see how my Kubernetes in production is retrieving the prediction. Awesome. We got again the probability for that model which is in production, for yes or no answer, for someone gonna claim 5 for that insurance policy holder or not. So we saw that we already have created an endpoint for the new production deployment that we have. And if I go to my Azure portal, let me check if I have already opened somewhere. Okay, I don't have it yet. So let me come here and show you that when we go to the resource group that we have for this project, you can see that now AKS or Kubernetes is added. And if I go there, we can see the namespaces that we created and the node pods and everything that you're deploying the model that is working inside my production. Remember, I wanted to show you something before we go further. If I get back to the pipeline, where's the pipeline? Yeah, that's here. If I click on edit, go to release and then edit it from there. Remember, I wanted to show you again, when I am testing my model which is in production, how do I retrieve the URI for testing that? If I come to prod test, this is the place that I'm getting the URI, and we wanted to test it to see how we are retrieving back the URI. And it didn't work because we haven't deployed that yet, but now we have deployed the models in AKS and we have a URI. So let's test it now. It's going to be all very similar to what we had for container instance, the staging environment. So let's check now for that AKS, the model, and let's get back the URI. Awesome, you can see that it retrieved the information about that deployment that I have in production for my Kubernetes, and as a part of that information, I have the scoring URI. And let's say I just want to retrieve that one. Again, exactly the same thing as we did for the container instance for the staging. So I'm getting the service show for this resource group, for this workspace, and for this endpoint, which I can get back to my Azure ML. Let's go to the endpoint. Previously we did it for container instance, but now we're production, and I'm gonna retrieve the endpoint for the URI for this endpoint, which is an AKS in production. So let's get back to, well, I have so many tabs. Okay, here, let's run it. Awesome, we got the URI just for that AKS, and that's how we ended up using that to test it when we were in DevOps pipeline. And we already, this is for the previous page, actually I approved this, and yeah, that's the place we got the URI. Perfect, Joe. So just quickly, let's wrap up what we discussed and what we have done. We were able to actually create our build pipeline to train model, test them, and we have our CI, which is continuous integration pipeline. And before that, we created an infrastructure pipeline that we were able to actually run and execute that and create our Azure Machine Learning Service as a code. And then when we were done with the infrastructure, we come and created our CI pipeline. I'm gonna click on edit to show you what we did again. So as you can see, we installed those extensions, the ML extension for CLI, we trained the model, downloaded the artifacts to use it for my release pipeline. So I came to the release pipeline, and for the release, I had two stages. First, deploying to staging, and then if it's successful, it's gonna be approved by someone, and it's gonna be deployed to production, and that's all. So we have now the MLOps lifecycle that someone, if automatically come up with a new development, there's a new file, new code in my repo, it automatically trigger my build pipeline to train a model. Then I'm gonna download those artifacts, and it's gonna trigger the release pipeline, which is here. So it will automatically go to staging, it's gonna ask someone to approve it, and it's gonna be deployed. So I have now continuous integration and continuous deployment, or CI/CD, in my DevOps, but this time I used it for machine learning. So again, that was a very high level and quick example. You can actually further modify that, make it even more complex with your customized requirements, but that example was simple enough actually to just understand the flow through an example to create that CI/CD story, now this time for machine learning. And I hope I enjoyed this video and all MLOps series. Wow, you made it. That's all. We were able to deploy MLOps solution on Azure. Remember just what we did. We respected all the concepts of DevOps, and we applied that in machine learning. Now we have an automated solution that can create my machine learning development lifecycle. Starting from development, the code my data scientists develop, all the way that we automatically push that to the production. There's just one video left, which is gonna show us how we can test this final solution as an MLOps on Azure. If I'm a data scientist, I'm going to develop a new code that will going to create a new or train a new model for me. How that solution can automatically trigger this all MLOps process to move the solution to staging, test it, and then move it to production, and have the solution all the way to production and start to provide service for the end users. Let's check that, and I'm sure you will like it. And that's the final video. Stay tuned, we're gonna see each other for the last video, video number 10 of MLOps video series on Azure.